From the very beginning, a young guy is kicked out of his house. Another young man asks him to take all his clothes and leave his house immediately. At this point, the boy realizes that he probably should not be offended by his friend. After all, he is the only one who can save the world. As he leaves, he decides to thank Ares for taking care of him and asks him to do his best to save their world. But even though he is well aware of the fact that Ares is a hero, he still wonders if he can cope with all the difficulties that he will meet on his way without his support. As it turns out, this moment is the beginning of the heroic journey adventurer with the strongest buff in the world. But in order to better understand what is happening, we must first learn the backstory of all that is going on. Turns out former adventurer Slada Maisty has been expelled from the hero group. Turns out once upon a time an old friend of his originally asked him to join this group, literally begging him to take that step. At that moment, the protagonist thought that he was just going to be in that group and expected to be able to help everyone else, while realizing that he was obliged to keep his skills secret. But at that moment, he was worried about other things. As it turned out, after all this happened, he has no money to go home and no money to eat. He even begins to realize that you can't do anything for nothing, or everything can be taken away from you. But in a way, he reassures himself that it can be considered a gift for the hero, and nothing can be done about it. The guy is well aware that he needs to urgently find a job in order to at least somehow feed himself and get out of this difficult situation, in order to somehow sort out his financial problems. The young man goes to the Adventurers Guild and realizes that he hasn't been here for a long time, and emphasizes that the guild is dedicated to collecting medicinal herbs and materials as well as killing monsters. As he heads towards the guild, the young man sees a grandmother who is carrying her bag of groceries. Naturally, the young hero immediately took notice of the elderly woman. He went straight to Grandma and just by touching her. She was very much frightened, but the young man was determined to help the old woman and immediately asked if she was okay and said he could help her because his conscience would not let him just pass by. At which point the woman said that it was because of her age and after so many years her back was starting to fail her, and she immediately apologized to the guy for possibly wasting his time with her. After the protagonist took the woman's bag and started carrying it, the grandmother immediately said that apparently she was starting to feel better, because she seemed to feel better. At which point the protagonist just said that it was great news. It turns out that her well-being has improved only because of his presence around, because he activated his skill called full automatic support. The young man realizes that probably the grandmother feels better because his ability worked on its own, because the effect of his ability is a temporary increase in physical ability and compensation for ailments by supporting the muscles. At this point, we learn that, as the name suggests, his skill works completely autonomously from the young man's desires and is not controlled by him personally. After all, he can't even affect it in any way with his desire to help someone. But the guy is well aware that the ability will be triggered as soon as someone is around. At this point, he even finds himself wondering if everyone else around him is okay. At this point, the grandmother notices the guy's torment because he only thinks about the fact that automatic support is not such a great skill, because the group of heroes and without it is strong enough to cope with their difficulties. After they reach the house of the old woman, she immediately thanked the guy for escorting her home. But the young man immediately said that she should not thank him, because it is always necessary to help those who are in trouble. At this point, we learn that he can't use automatic support on himself, but he successfully uses it for the benefit of others, because if he can't save the world directly, he will at least help others in this endeavor. At this moment, the grandmother asks the main character if he wants to eat some ice cream. Naturally, at this moment, the guy's thoughts are filled, because as it turns out, he likes sweets very much. Guys does not allow him to accept such a delicious gift from his grandmother, and he immediately refuses it. But he is betrayed by his own stomach and starts rumbling very strongly, at which point his grandmother insisted that he go and take her treat as well. Sometime the young man still reached the adventurers. There he was met by a young girl who immediately asked if the protagonist wanted to join the guild, but he immediately informs her that once upon a time long ago, he was already among the adventurers, but then decided to retire. After hearing these words, the young girl asked if the main character had an adventurer's badge, but as it turned out, the young man did not think that it would be needed, and therefore said that he did not have this badge with him. But the girl was not confused and immediately found a solution to this problem. And yes, and the guy pen asked him to fill out a form so they can verify the information. With their main office, at this point, the guy was a little surprised and immediately asked if it would somehow identify his identity, to which the girl smiled and said that, of course, this method is the most effective because it uses magic ink. Hearing these words, the protagonist was immediately encouraged and happy, because there is hope that this pen can really help to identify him. He realizes that then in this case he must clearly write out each letter on the sheet. After he had done everything required of him, the girl informed him that she would call him as soon as they confirmed his identity, and so he had to wait a bit. Suddenly, Slad hears someone starting a loud argument behind his back, and so he decides to see what's going on. At that moment, a young elf woman is arguing with some man and tells him in his forehead that instead of touching someone for unauthorized places, it would be better for that man to go hunt at least one goblin. At that, she immediately called that man a bearded old man, which naturally embarrassed him incredibly badly. At this point, the protagonist observes what is happening and realizes that earlier he heard that elves do not like the smell of alcohol, and therefore they are not often met in such places. At the same time, looking at how the girl is dressed, he realizes that she is almost naked. And so also looking at her opponent and taking into account the way he looks, the protagonist made some conclusions. He realized that given the bearded man's equipment, he was most likely a veteran, and this elf woman had probably just recently arrived from her homeland. Suddenly, the guy's thoughts are interrupted by the man's loud banging on the table. He immediately starts to put the girl on the spot and asks the girl if she even knows who she's talking to. But the protagonist could not stay away and therefore decided to intervene in the conflict of these two people. He immediately asked why they should not just peacefully separate in order not to quarrel in the guild. Of course, the elven woman disagreed with the main character's opinion and immediately asked him what he was carrying and asked him to stay out of their conflict. But then the veteran looked at the girl and laughed out loud and stated that he had just christened her into the guild, and so she should be grateful to him for what he had done. But the strong-willed girl completely disagrees with these words, and once again begins to get even angrier at the actions of this cocky veteran. Seeing that the conflict is gaining new momentum, the protagonist again intervenes and asks that both participants cool down. Looking at the elf, he asked her not to give in to the provocations of someone who is a head taller than her. But at the same time, the young hero did not forget to tell the veteran that such actions on his part are really horrible, for they are completely obscene. Naturally, the veteran was immediately taken aback by such words and, turning to the protagonist, said that he had not seen his face here before, at which point we can see how the veteran is actually very angry. At this, the veteran immediately stated that, if judging by the protagonist's equipment, he is another lardass in this place. At this point, Slud realizes that this man, just in a rage, but immediately the veteran grabs the protagonist by his clothes and declares that any insolent person in this guild needs his sensitive parenting. And so he tells the protagonist that they should go out to settle the matter, but Slud immediately declares that in his opinion they should not go that far in solving this issue, which naturally surprises the veteran. But he is not going to retreat and decides to teach the insolent who stood up for the elf, and so he still pulls the protagonist on the street. At this point, the pixie couldn't stay away and grabbed the protagonist's arm to declare that it was her fault after all. In order to protect the protagonist, the girl even stated that it was her who crossed the line and therefore she was at fault. But the veteran is not going to give up and declares that this issue already concerns only him and the protagonist, but not the elf. And therefore, he is still unshakable and insists on going out and dealing with the protagonist. When they found themselves on the street, the main character was very much surprised by what was happening. He immediately asked the veteran if he really wants to do it right on the main street, and even offers to move away to some nook. But the veteran isn't going anywhere and says there's nothing wrong with that, because he needs to kick the protagonist's ass for everyone to see. Immediately after these words, the veteran pounced on Slade with a burning desire to punish him right in front of everyone. At this point, the protagonist realizes who he's messed with and is very surprised by it. Turns out the veteran they had a conflict with is a bear killer. It turns out his name is Ganza, and he is a rank B adventurer in the guild. And we also learn that there is no one in this county who is stronger than this veteran. At that moment, the elfess realizes what just happened, and realizes that the protagonist protected her from such a strong opponent. Suddenly, the girl from the question desk comes back and, thanking for waiting, asks if anyone has seen where the kid who was standing there disappeared too. Then the elf decides to tell in all that happened, and states that a guy named Ganza got angry and took the newcomer outside. Of course, the girl from the counter was very much frightened by this and immediately asked if the newcomer had black hair. The moment she found out that it was true, she realized that the newcomer was the young man who had approached her, and so she immediately decided to run outside to save him. But suddenly, at the moment when she runs out, the girl declares that she needs to quickly save Ganza. In her opinion, it is the veteran will be defeated in this fight. Naturally, the elf is very much surprised by what she heard. Parallel to this on the street, the main character stands in front of the Ganzu. As if he has no fear, he realizes how he should fight such a strong opponent. At the moment when he strikes, the protagonist realizes that this man is like a huge bear, then naturally gets some advantages over his enemies. Because of his abilities, he has unexpected speed and savagery beyond all limits, and his punches are quite powerful. But even his strength cannot stop the protagonist, because he easily dodges his blows and realizes that they only had to be strong if Ganzu hit him, which of course did not happen. At this point, Ganzu was very angry and even a little surprised at what happened. He even called the protagonist a creep. Immediately after that, trying to strike a couple more blows and naturally did not hit a single time. asked if the protagonist is definitely a beginner because he has some incredible speed. But the protagonist decided once again to mock the veteran and looked him straight in the eye and said that he is not some super fast, and it is Ganza on the contrary is too slow. After a few more blows which the protagonist successfully avoided, the Ganza collapsed on his knee. Naturally, he quickly changed his opinion of this strange newcomer, and even wondered why he was so quickly out of breath without even throwing a single punch. At this point, the crowd that had gathered watched in amazement, thinking that Ganza was just playing with the newcomer, and immediately began to cheer him up, telling him to stop feeling sorry for the protagonist, at which point only a few people wondered who the guy was next to the veteran. At this point, the protagonist leans over his opponent and asks him if they can finally get this over with, because he absolutely does not want to humiliate such a promising adventurer as Hans. Naturally, the veteran disagreed with this statement and asked the protagonist not to joke with him in such a way, but then the protagonist just looked at his opponent and tried to tease him once again, asking if his armor is not too heavy. Suddenly, the veteran wants to throw another punch, but he can't even lift his hand from the floor, which surprises him a lot. He immediately realizes that he can't move at all, and looks straight at the protagonist, wondering what he's done to him. Then the calm young man declared that he had done absolutely nothing. While Ganza was again in a frenzy, then the protagonist also decides to tell Gans why he can't do anything. It's because he's turned against him, and so the protagonist's skill makes him weaker and weaker as a result of automatic weakening. Naturally, it turns out that Ganza has never heard of something like this before and immediately wondered what kind of skill that automatically weakens enemies. At this point, the self-satisfied protagonist declares that this is a very unique skill that he has. It turns out that a unique skill is a skill that cannot be compared to anything. They cannot be obtained naturally, and each such gift is unique. It can be obtained only once in his life. Usually the owners of such skills have always entered history as heroes. Hearing these words, Ganza looks directly at the protagonist and realizes that if this guy really is the owner of a unique skill, he is most likely incredibly strong. Well, that's when doubts begin to overwhelm him, and he asks the protagonist why he would reveal his abilities to someone like him. After all, the veteran knows that naturally there must be people who are jealous of his skills and will want to kill him, as well as organizations that would like to take advantage of such strong skills of the protagonist. According to the veteran, information about skills should be the most intimate knowledge of any person, and therefore he is very much surprised that such information the protagonist revealed to the whole public. But then the young man states that he did it because he wants Ganza to stay alive, and so he immediately asks the veteran to immediately surrender in order to preserve his life. Naturally, the veteran is absolutely furious at such statements, and immediately asks how he can surrender to such a newcomer as the protagonist, but then Slod shuts him up by asking him to be quiet. Then the protagonist immediately begins to describe all the charms of his ability, and says that if the veteran does not surrender immediately, his muscles will gradually weaken and bones will break. According to him, without them, his internal organs will tear apart, and then he will lose consciousness. And the end result of his skill will only be the very painful death of his opponent, which in this case is a veteran. Naturally, Ganza immediately declares that this is complete nonsense, and tells the protagonist not to even try to joke with him like that, because it cannot be that he is an adventurer of B rank to die such a death. In his opinion, it is simply impossible. But suddenly, like a thunderclap, the veteran begins to weaken more and more and falls to the ground as if someone had hit him, at which point the protagonist rises above him. It turns out that for the veteran's armor has suddenly become too heavy, and he is no longer able to hold it with his muscles, at which point he starts breathing harder and harder. At this point, the protagonist reminds the veteran of his words and says that's why he asked about no armor. At this point, he also says that the rate of loss of muscle mass is more noticeable than expected. And if this continues, the situation could be quite dangerous for the adventurer. The protagonist is still trying to keep the veteran from a quick death, and asks him once again to say that he wants to surrender, but he still continues to insist on his own. And even without the strength to rise from the earth, asks himself how he can surrender and thereby admit defeat. He is very much embarrassed by the fact that the man who will probably defeat him in the fight is an ordinary newcomer, and therefore his pride and glory of the strongest in the city do not allow him to give up. At this point, the elf appears with a girl from the guild, and then the girl who received the information calls the protagonist an adventurer of SSS rank. According to her, the guild master personally wants to meet the protagonist. At this time, the whole crowd is very much surprised by such a high rank of the alleged newcomer. At this point, Ganza was finally able to breathe a sigh of relief, and realizing that the protagonist is not a rookie, and that losing to such a strong hero would not be shameful, he finally decides to accept his defeat. Immediately afterward, the veteran felt much better, and began to feel more at ease about his reputation, and the heaviness that was still present due to the ability finally faded away. At this point, the protagonist notices a change and realizes that apparently the veteran's hostility is finally gone. Seeing what is happening, the elf is very happy for the man who stood up for her honor. This is noticed by the main character, who again draws attention to the fact that the girl is almost naked. This moment is thrust upon the protagonist at the moment. He only thinks about the fact that he is suddenly being hugged by a naked woman. Even while being on the protagonist, the pixie still continues to cheer him on in victory, while the protagonist realizes how many temptations are now in front of him. Then the elf who was on top immediately stated that she was very much afraid that the protagonist might get hurt because of her. Naturally, upon hearing such words, the protagonist immediately apologized to the girl for making her worry, and he learned that her name was Ethics. At this moment, the guild master came to the scene, while the crowd was still very much surprised that the guild girl had said that this guy was a top-rank adventurer, in the opinion that such a thing simply could not be. But all doubts were immediately dispelled after the guild master fell to his knees before the protagonist and dubbed him once again an adventurer of the highest rank, after which he even stated that their guild apologized for the inconvenience caused in front of such a strong hero. At this point, the crowd was very much surprised while the protagonist was enjoying his victory, and as if even feeling a little uncomfortable about the glory that had suddenly descended upon him. It turns out that he would be very happy if the guild people did not inform anyone that he is such a powerful hero. But the guildmaster did not stop there and only said with surprise that he was very surprised that such an adventurer of such a high rank can appear in a guild like theirs. At this point, Slud immediately declares that all his merits are in the past and he is now a mere rookie. Naturally, after saying that, the guildmaster was surprised at the young man's modesty and even said that he had heard some rumors from across the sea about how invincible the young man was. At this point, we learn that the protagonist is really at a bit of a loss because his abilities are quite ordinary, but two unique abilities make his allies stronger and his enemies weaker, which helps him win all of his battles. As it turned out, the protagonist hoped that he could start a new life here, and that's why he sailed to the New World. At this point, the guildmaster distracts him from his thoughts and wonders what brought such a strong hero to their guild. Hearing these words, Slad, a little embarrassed, asks the master if he really didn't understand why he was here. But the young man immediately pointed out that it was all about money. After saying that, the guildmaster immediately laughed, asking the protagonist if he was joking about money problems. But the face of the main character spoke about something else, because on his face you could immediately understand that he is in a very difficult situation for himself. But then the guildmaster immediately states that a hero of this rank has power, status, and prestige. That is why he thinks the protagonist will never have to worry about money. But then Slad immediately emphasizes that he does not have so much money because he lives in the village and is self-sufficient. Naturally, the master once again did not believe the young man and asked if he was really joking with him for the second time, but the face of the protagonist, just like the first time, did not change at all, which completely proved his words. Then the guildmaster realized the situation this young man was in and said that they needed to remove all jokes aside. After all, a guy should have a badge S or higher, which gives him the opportunity to get free food, drinks, and lodging in the stores of guild members. These words surprised the protagonist, and after a while he was in front of a very beautiful building. At this point, he even cried because apparently it was the first time he had ever used his high rank, at which time we can see the elf girl watching where the protagonist is going. After a while, Slad also notices a girl who is not far from him. At this point, the guy is a little surprised, but he still cannot take his eyes off the unseen beautiful, who also began to have some feelings for the protagonist. At the same time, in a completely different place, two girls are very angry about the situation that has developed around their friend. They claim that they can't believe that their friend just left like that. They unanimously claim that there is no way that he just ran away and didn't tell them anything. At which point, the guy who kicked the protagonist out is just watching the girls. But he does not hold back and begins to tease the protagonist. According to him, he does not care that such a small fish like Sweet left their team. But even so, Slad is confident that the band of heroes who are supposed to save their world won't fall apart just because he was kicked out of it. But at this point, the girls do not stop wondering about the fate of their friend. It turns out one of them is a witch whose name is Rameri, and the second is a holy maiden named Disha. After a while, the Holy Virgin even believes that the protagonist is a real scoundrel who ran away betraying them, and so she claims that she will not rest until she cracks him at least once. But the witch realizes there's something wrong, and realizes that the situation is much more complicated. That's why she keeps saying that Slad couldn't have done this to them. Turns out the Holy Maiden was so angry because the one who taught a half-breed like her, the language was the main character. At this point, the girls don't understand how he could do this to them, and the Holy Virgin decides she can't move on until she beats up the guy who betrayed her comrades. At this point, The hero Ares, who kicked Slade out of the hero team, watches the girls leave. Parallel to this, the main character finds a book that tells stories about heroes. Turns out he's in the town flea market, a place where he can find anything his soul desires. He expects to find information about the races in this book, and only after opening it he learns that the dwarves are very stubborn, but also very strong agile. There are also books he learns that elves show almost no emotion and are very shy and distrustful of strangers. At that moment he is swooped by Ethics, who, because of jumping too quickly towards the protagonist Daisha, manages to knock him off his feet. Naturally, the girl did not want to hurt the protagonist in any way, and so immediately began to apologize to him. At which point, the young man thought only that it seems that this girl is too different from the elves he had read about. Suddenly, the action moves us back an hour, where it turns out that the master is handing out an errand. He wants to get fresh slime from the ice cave Corona. It turns out to fulfill this mission. Volunteered the protagonist, who, according to his own words, would like to try candy from the ice slime that give to the reward. But the master is stubborn to this and says that the protagonist can eat and even every day, because he has a lot of money. According to the wizard, it would be better if such a strong hero would better perform some easy task for himself. For example, to tame the dragon Elzod in the west, but Slade immediately says that he doesn't want to do this mission because it's not an easy one, at which point the men move the assignment around the table so quickly that it's hard to keep track of it. At this point, the master says that if the protagonist does not want to tame dragons, then let him explore the old ruins. Well, suddenly a girl who works here intervenes in their conversation and informs the master that the table burst into flames and started burning because of too much speed with which they move the envelope on the table. At this point, an ethicist who is incredibly worried about the protagonist runs into the room. She immediately comes running in asking, "What's all the hype going on here?" Naturally, the girl also complains to her new friend that there are very few missions in the guild that she can go to alone with such a low rank. She even asks the main character if he is free to help her complete one of the missions, the assignment that is at the girl. And it turns out that it is an assignment to eliminate goblins. And it suits him perfectly because he just wanted to do something easy. At this point, the master once again intervenes in their conversation and states that with the education of the newcomers, the adventurers' power will grow and their guild will begin to prosper. Along with this process, he said, the economy of the bustling town they live in will also begin to flourish. Naturally, the main character and his new girlfriend listen to these words and do not understand what the master is talking about. But then he only states that the guys can go on the road, and at the same time he asks the protagonist to prepare the elf for the task. Suddenly the action moves back to the present time, and it turns out the protagonist, together with the elfess, still decided to go on a joint mission. But since they have no money, they are obliged to look for necessary things at the flea market. It turned out that the girl jumped on the protagonist to show him one of her finds. She is very happy that she was able to find the right dagger for the protagonist, because apparently it will be suitable for the elimination of goblins, but she does not understand why he needs it, because the class of the protagonist is higher than those who use. Then the protagonist decided to explain to the girl why he will need the dagger after all, but suddenly some man enters the room who is concerned about what is happening. At this point, Slade realizes that this man is the owner of the flea market. Naturally, the guy immediately says that it is not at all what the man might have thought, but then the man only stated that he let the guys just look around while he was away. But since he dislikes this whole situation very much, the man immediately started yelling at the hero and made them immediately start cleaning up, or else he will make them pay for all these things. At this time, the guildmaster is having coffee with his subordinate. It turns out the girl doesn't understand why the master gave this task to the protagonist and the elf girl so easily. After all, the girl naively believes they just need to deal with the goblins. And in her opinion, it all looks kind of weird. But then, self-satisfied, and the master states that these words are rude on the part of the girl. According to him, really the essence of this task is to deal with goblins. But naturally, there is a little nuance. According to him yesterday, a group of experienced adventurers also went on this mission and did not return. According to him, everyone is already starting to whisper about this assignment and is bypassing it just in case. And that is why this assignment has also become an assignment of special rank. At this time, the protagonists are already in the forest, wondering if it's true that goblins are the size of a normal child. Then she also says that she once encountered goblins very many times in the elven thicket. Naturally, the protagonist agrees with her words and even states that singly goblins are weak and careless creatures, but their weakness is not eternal, and according to the protagonist, they can become dangerous when they gather in groups. And that's why the guild needs to send expeditions to clean up the area. Also, the main character informs Ethics that there are goblins that attack girls and allow themselves all sorts of obscenities. According to him, these goblins even have a separate name. and they are called hobgoblins. According to him, this subrace of goblins have powers far exceeding their usual counterparts. After all, they are the descendants of a girl and the Earth race who became pregnant by a goblin. According to him, these creatures are smarter and stronger than the rest, and in addition, some individuals can exceed 10 meters in height. He also informs the girl that after all this appeared Goblin Mage, but at this point the guy suddenly realizes that he should stop telling such stories. He realized that he was talking too much and might scare Ethics with his words because that was not something a girl should talk about. But it turned out that Ethics was not bored at all when listening to the stories of the main character and even apparently was happy about it. She stated that she understood him and even praised the guy, saying he was very funny. According to her, she assumed she may have been bothering the main character with her request to join her, but now she sees that everything is really okay. At this point, the protagonist once again thought about the fact that usually elves behave differently and don't trust humans, but the Ethics are completely different. At this point, the girl declares that if she had to assemble a team, she would only want to invite the protagonist into it, but suddenly their conversations are interrupted as they find themselves on the trail of a goblin. Suddenly, they began to head in the direction where the tracks were heading, and noticed there a huge pile of goblins that had already become a team. Naturally, the heroes watch them from afar and even realize that their lair is right in the middle of the forest. But at this point, the guy is most interested in how they can get rid of the sentries that guard the goblin village, at which point, Ethics remembered that she still hasn't told the protagonist about her abilities. Suddenly, she gets on her knees and as if praying calls out to someone. Turns out she summoned a wind spirit called a sylph. Naturally, the protagonist was a bit surprised by this and immediately asked the girl if she can summon spirits. He thinks that if so, she may be a spiritual priestess, at which point the girl states that this is the case, also finally realizes that priestesses have a special skill, and the more their bodies are denuded, the more intimacy with the spirits increases. He finally began to realize why the girl is always dressed in the same underwear. He even tells her that now it became clear to him why she has such a revealing outfit. After all, before he thought that she is just an exhibitionist, but choosing the wrong words instead of praising the girl just really pissed her off, she immediately pounced on him and asked him if Slod really thinks these things about her. At this point, the protagonist, to protect himself from the girl without strength, asks her to calm down because of the noise they may be noticed by goblins. Slod also declares that it's time for them to leave jokes aside and asks the girl to borrow the wind spirit's powers and start shooting goblins from here. At this point, even the elf noticed that apparently her friend is more serious than usual this time. At this point, the protagonist suggests that in all likelihood, one arrow should split up and hit 3 enemies at once. Hearing these words, Elvin incredibly surprised because, according to her own words, she has never done anything like this before, but then the protagonist says that he cannot help her and asks her to just trust her friend, the spirit. At the same time, the main character's ability called Automatic Support is unexpectedly activated as well. It was thanks to his ability that the girl suddenly became much stronger than she normally is, and her arrows began to pierce one goblin after another. Naturally, the elfess was very much surprised at what had just happened before her eyes and even wondered what that terrifying power had just been within her. But the protagonist, in order not to show the girl his skill, immediately begins to praise the spirit, stating that in this little girl, amazing power that was able to hit 3 people at once. He even calls her very powerful, but the pixie immediately intervenes in the conversation between the boy and the spirit and says that she too would be happy if he praised her as well. Suddenly, the protagonist notices one elf who still managed to survive the attack. Naturally, the protagonist immediately grabbed his dagger and deftly caught up with this goblin. Then, using it as well, he struck a few more blows to make sure the goblin was defeated. At this point, the elfess simply watched her new comrade's actions and stated that she accurately shot right at the goblin's vulnerable spot. Naturally, the protagonist himself obviously understands this, because he is well aware that under the influence of his power, it is impossible to miss. Right after that, the main character once again pulls out his dagger and starts chopping up Goblin's body parts. The elf who is watching this is very much surprised and asks her teammate what she is doing here, but then the guy claims that he's collecting materials because this Goblin's body parts will help them get the reward. He argues that they can use these body parts as proof of victory, since they get a certain amount of money for goblins. Realizing that the girl is a little upset by what she sees, the guy calms her down and tells her that the job of an adventurer is not as wonderful as the job of a hero. According to him, money, fame, and ambition drive them. And in this game, the one who is ready to go for everything survives. At this point, looking at the girl's face, the protagonist realizes that she is too kind because even though they are done with the monsters, she unwittingly gave Phil an arrow to give them a chance. Turns out the main character is doing this because he doesn't have any special skills to teach the girl, but he realizes he can only show her what the real life of an adventurer is like. At that moment, he walked over to the girl and handed her his dagger and told her that she too should try to split the goblin apart. Then the guy even says it's all really very violent but has good consequences. According to him now, the girl realizes what is the life of an adventurer, and knowing the truth, she still has a chance to return home. Well, suddenly, a huge goblin appears out of the blue and is about to attack the main characters. Naturally, Sloud immediately recognizes what kind of goblin it is and realizes it's the Hobgoblin. Even the main character is a little surprised at how big he is and realizes that this goblin is so deranged that he doesn't even look at them. At this point, the guy's only thought is that the enemy obviously has to be hostile to him in order for the debuff to work so he can defeat the creature. And he's very worried about the safety of their being here. But at this point, the wind spirit intervenes, which has so far helped Ethics and once again helps the protagonist. Apparently, thanks to the main character's ability, the girl has once again become much stronger. And so, using all her strength to the max, she was able to pull off one very nifty trick. Naturally, thanks to such a strong upgrade of her abilities, she was able to defeat even this goblin. But at the same time, she called the main character her family, which incredibly surprised him. At this point, the girl started to justify herself to him and said that naturally it is not what he thought, but the protagonist stands firmly on his own and wonders what it means in this case, while he feels the pain that the girl causes him. Then the girl stated that the main character saved her at the risk of his life. And so now they are truly a family. And according to her, protecting those dear to her heart is an selfish desire. And she immediately asks, is this desire enough for her to be a true adventurer? Suddenly, the protagonist remembers talking to someone who informed him that elves don't get along well with humans, but that there are certain people they can call part of their family. It turns out elves call so recognized comrades and to the end of their lives cherish these strong ties. Finally, thanks to these memories, the protagonist could understand why Ethics seemed to him completely different. He once again remembers that elves are rumored to be very cold-blooded and distrustful of strangers. But in reality, no one else cares for their family as sincerely as they do. At this point, the protagonist cuts off the goblin's ear to take it with him, at which time the girl looks very upset by what she sees. But after a bit of thinking, she declares that if you cook the goblin's ear properly, you'll get a good medicine that will definitely help cure a lot of bruises. Hearing these words, the main character was very happy and, looking at his new friend, said that she is really very kind. Well then, the girl once again declares that she would also very much like to perform tasks and travel with the main character. Then Slad didn't hesitate long to extend his hand to the girl and declared that they were now a real team. Hearing these words, again pounced on her friend and declared that she would certainly try very hard to match him. At this time in the team of the hero again, Discord, Ares is not happy that the girl is going to leave, and so asks her how she can just take and leave. But the girl is adamant and says that her journey as a member of the hero's team is over. At which point Ares looks her in the back and says that his team is not just a bunch of adventurers. He even tries to forcefully stop the girl by asking if she's really going to run away and give up saving the world. But Virgo turned out to be very strong and pushed the guy and asked him if he really wanted to try to stop her from leaving somehow. According to her, this decision is weighted because, unlike the witch and the Holy Virgin, she is completely indifferent to the fate of the world. Turns out the girl thought the hero's team was a real chance to get more treasure from the dungeons, after all it would seem. What could be better than that? But at the same time, she sensitively notes that now, Ares has nothing of the glory he had before. The girl even says that among them, everything was very good, until the simple guy, who everyone called a simple porter, left. In her opinion, it was his departure that changed the fate of the hero's team. Naturally, hearing these words, Ares got very angry and even clenched his fist in anger. He didn't understand what this had to do with Slad, who they thought was just a normal kid, and even tried to hit his girlfriend at this point. But the girl was very strong and easily dodged. Aether made the hero immediately collapse to the ground. She said she doesn't want to do it anymore, and once again expressed her intentions to leave. Also, she emphasizes that she is not doing it because she wants to run away or become a traitor. Well then, Ares got even more furious and said that even if the protagonist participated in the battle, nothing would change, and he called the protagonist very rude words. At that moment, the girl stopped right in front of the door and turned to him and said that this is what she was going to check, and then immediately said goodbye to the hero. After some time, she came out of his house, heard loud shouts of that and his displeasure. Then the girl realizes that from now on she decides where she wants to go, but she wonders if her old friend will be angry too. At this time, some strange creature is watching the protagonist along with the elven woman in the dungeon. This creature has very scary hands, and he is well aware that the protagonist in a rage is simply terrible, so they must be careful with him. At this time, in the house of the hero Arete, The ceremony that was timed to coincide with his adulthood had begun, and so now everyone would have to find out his true skill. The crowd that came cheered and called the young man a born hero. It turns out everyone knows that in his 15 years he became a savior, and the only one who can defeat the devil. It turns out that the hero is not so kind as it may seem at first glance, because he does not care about anyone but himself. But all this crowd that dances to his tune, he is very happy, and he only has to enjoy how they bow their heads to him. But things didn't happen the way the hero expected them to, and Slad got in his way. At a certain point in time, he was sure that if the main character disappeared from his team, the girls would finally pay attention to him. But now, it's not clear to him why it ended up that way. After a simple porter left their team, the team began to disintegrate. Ares was more and more neglected. At this time, the protagonist along with Ethics are exploring the cave and can't find anything worthwhile there. At this point, the elven woman is even more despondent, because there are only rocks, earth, and sand everywhere. She asks the protagonist how long they have to dwell in this cave, but the protagonist is focused on something else, and didn't even hear his girlfriend's question. According to him, the goblins can spot them, so they need to immediately extinguish their torches and move further through the cave in total darkness. At this point, the ethicist said that it is not difficult for her to do it, but in this case, the main character will be completely cannot see anything. But the guy says that in time, his eyes will get used to the darkness, and to everything else, he has a successful experience. According to him, his comrade was once a specialized thief, and although he walked behind him and could not see the traps, but thanks to the imitation of his movements, he could always bypass them. But according to him now, everything is even a little easier, because he is together with the elf and she only needs to be on guard and cover him with the power of night vision. Hearing this, the ethicist immediately said that in that case, the protagonist could rely on her. At the same time, the girl doubts that they need to be on guard, because in her opinion, maybe that big goblin was their leader. At this point, the main character says that in his opinion, there may still be a goblin who is very big, and therefore is most likely the leader. However, he notices that the goblin has lost his temper so much that he completely missed them on the way. In the guy's opinion, it could only be because he could see someone even stronger than himself, and as if he had the impression that the goblin was just running away from something. At this point, the girl was very surprised and realized that they really needed to be on their guard, but suddenly, a trap appears right in front of them. Naturally, the girl starts laughing at her, saying it's too obvious trap. It's not even clear to her who could even get into something like this. Much more alert than she is, and so immediately orders the girl to stop. But she didn't have time to react to this order, and so she still fell into one of the traps that were set up here. In this case, the protagonist cannot be so easy to spend, and so he manages at the last moment to reach out to his friend and thus get her out of the trap. After the girl got out, she immediately hugged the protagonist and was very much frightened. They finally realized that the goblins made a false trap from above and made another more effective one from below. Finally, the adventurers realized that these goblins were too smart. Immediately afterward, Ethics decided to see just how deep a hole she might have fallen into, and as it turned out, it was very deep. The girl immediately shouted that even though these creatures are goblins, this kind of trap is insolent even for them. The protagonist began to analyze what was happening and realized that the position of the trap was perfectly thought out, and if you go around or bypass it, you will still fall into the hole. At this point, the protagonist emphasized that this trap was designed very cleverly, and most likely they are waiting for a goblin mage. Naturally, hearing this, the girl was surprised and immediately asked how strong this mage is. At this point, the protagonist told her that the goblin can use dark magic and cast curses using negative emotions. Then the protagonist began to wonder if they could crawl under the ratchets, but he immediately ruled out that option. He believes that if the goblin shows up unexpectedly, they'll be at a disadvantage, and he doesn't want to neglect his girlfriend's safety. But suddenly the main character realizes how to get out of this situation, then very much scares even his girlfriend. It turns out that he suddenly became interested in whether the elf can summon an earth spirit, and he wants that spirit to be as small as possible. In his opinion, even a small and weak spirit can help them. Naturally, the girl immediately began to use her abilities, and after some time and still managed to summon the earth spirit, she looked at such a small spirit in amazement and realized that she had succeeded in her task. Then the main character asked that the girl trust him, and even stated that she, along with the earth spirit Nomu, will be able to handle it. Suddenly, 3 goblins appear on their path after all. The protagonist realizes that everything happens exactly as he expected, and these goblins were able to dodge all the traps that were on their way. In doing so, he notices that they are deliberately ringing their ratchets to attract the attention of the adventurers. Immediately after these remarks, the goblins suddenly rushed forward and decided to attack the heroes. But as it turns out, the main character originally thought of everything exactly this way, and they also have one very good trap. As the goblins approached, they grew weaker and weaker. And then the trap that the protagonist came up with worked, and they began to fall underground. Ethics in turn immediately picked up her bow and began attacking the hostile goblins. Already after a couple of moments, they were able to overpower their enemy, and the joyful ethos stated that the protagonist had come up with a great plan and that they were able to deal with this attack. Then the protagonist finally explained what his plan was and said that he assumed that if the clever goblin was running everything, then it was likely that his subordinates must also know the location of these traps. Immediately afterward, he looked at the girl in his own words and remembered what powers she controlled. At that moment in time, he remembered the Earth Spirit who was capable of controlling the Earth, and so he decided that it was with the help of this spirit that they would be able to expand the original hole of enormous size. Then he once again noticed that the goblins were running along the path. They had originally thought safe until they fell into their trap, a very simple plan in his opinion. But it would be impossible for an ordinary man to set such a trap. According to him, he was able to learn it from an old friend, for it was he who taught him how to win by outsmarting the enemy. But then ethics says that the most unforgivable aspect of this trap is that they will have to ask this little spirit to bury the hole that was so hard to dig. But suddenly the spirit answered the girl, then hitting the ground. He raised his hands, at which point the protagonist realized that the spirit seemed to be asking to rely on him. After a while, the protagonist is again looking for some attributes for which they can get a reward, but after a short search, he realizes that all these actions are useless because there is nothing special here. Well, suddenly Ethics asks the protagonist to look somewhere, and informs him that the road they came from and other paths are connected. Also, according to the girl, there are surprisingly many footprints in this place, and then she realizes that most likely this room was definitely used to move between tracks. In her opinion, because of this, goblins could show up here at any time. And then the girl asks the protagonist, what will happen if they decide to leave here friends of the spirit of the earth, because she realizes that they will definitely cope with the goblins. Then the protagonist pondered this suggestion for a while and emphasized that a spirit could only be summoned in one place at a time, and so he would prefer to walk this path together with the Earth Spirit. Then the girl says that if he is against it, then in this case, this time she will call a spirit that is bigger, and they will fight together. Of course, the protagonist does not agree with this and asks the girl to stop, but she had already summoned a spirit that turned out to be very large. The ethicist was very surprised that she could summon a spirit of that size, while the protagonist was well aware that her powers were much greater. At this point, the protagonist announces that they can't go any further until each other Earth wakes up. At which point Ethics tries to wake him up somehow. The girl cries and apologizes to the protagonist because she didn't plan to summon such a huge spirit. But the protagonist calms her down and tells the girl that it's not her fault because he assumes that it could have happened because of him. The protagonist, of course, realizes that his automatic support has its drawbacks. He realizes that he is unknowingly improving the skills of the object of support, and thus it can be said that this ability strengthens the body of a friend and slows down the enemy. In his own opinion, it gives power, but it cannot be controlled. It was for this reason that he had recently asked the girl to summon the smallest spirit to clean up that pit. Suddenly, a goblin is seen in the distance, who was very surprised by what he saw. Naturally small and cowardly creature immediately began to run, that immediately noticed, and the main characters. Then the guy said that there might be a boss room in that direction, so they should get ready to strike. At this point, the girl realizes that then in that case she must be involved, and immediately covers one of the passages with earth. The protagonist was very happy about this. But then the ethics only said that in addition they can block all the other ways, and then the reinforcements of goblins will not pass. And when the enemy is weakened and tries to escape here, it will catch up with Zapadnia. According to the protagonist, they can put dug up earth in this passage. At this point, the protagonist along with his girlfriend were very happy, and they finally decided that the decisive battle should begin. But at this point, the protagonist a little sad because he tried to remember the last time he was so happy to adventure as with this girl. Turns out in the hero's team, he only heard swearing. And after his retirement, people challenged him time and time again because of his skill. Unexpected sadness of the protagonist noticed, and his teammate who immediately asked the guy what happened, she does not understand the reason why he froze in place. But the guy did not want to tell the girl about his worries, and so, referring to the pleasant aroma, said that nothing like that happened to him. While he realized that in the end, this is how real adventure should be, after a while they came upon a tunnel that was littered with someone's remains. Naturally, ethics immediately declared that this was not a very pleasant atmosphere. At the same time, the most important character stated that goblins are very fond of such rituals, and that is why it seems to him that the mage is quite close to this place. At which point, Ethics begins to look more and more closely at one of the skulls. She suddenly wonders if this is really a real human skeleton. But suddenly, from their conversation, they are distracted by new goblins. At this moment, seeing what is happening, the girl decided that they have an internal conflict. Noticing the fire, the protagonist realized that this fire is a fire magic spell, and in that case the boss is really somewhere very close. Unexpectedly, they still reached the place where the leader of all the goblins was and began to survey the area. Suddenly, the protagonist is very upset, because he immediately noticed that this is not just a magician he expected to see here. According to his remarks, this goblin is a monster of a rare species, namely the Goblin Witch. In doing so, he once again remembers that goblins are small monsters that congregate in groups. And in fact, top-class goblins are divided into only two types. He knows that such species are hobgoblins who use only their physical strength, and magic goblins who wield hate magic, which is what makes them so powerful. It also turns out that in their hierarchy, males treat females as slaves, but occasionally a female is able to mutate and gain the skills of a goblin mage, and then it's the female species that rises to the very top of the goblin food chain. According to the protagonist, this is the monster of a rare species that they met in front of them. Also, the protagonist knows that the hatred of witches to oppression by men is different from that which moves goblins' magicians. Now he realizes that apparently that hobgoblin whom they met tried to escape from her domain. That's why the guy wonders what this place is. Immediately afterward, the guy asks the girl if this monster is at one with the rest of the goblins, and so decides that they need to call for backup immediately. But the girl interrupts the protagonist and asks him to pay attention to one very scary detail for her. Suddenly, it turns out that these goblins were able to capture the adventurers who had previously tried to overpower them. All these people were led out of one of the caves with chains on their hands in a colony, then taking into account everything she saw. The elf says that that horrifying path was also littered with human bones, and so she assumes that maybe they're going to use these guys in some weird ritual. Then the protagonist realizes that even if they engage in battle with this monster, it is an impossible fight for a novice like his girlfriend, and he assumes that this monster must have rare abilities. But this does not stop his girlfriend, who immediately rushed into battle to save the other adventurers. At this point, the protagonist recalls the moments when he was on the hero's team, and how he was humiliated there. At the same time, these memories could not pass without a trace, and the protagonist even suspects that at the moment when he was called mediocre, Ares was right. He realizes that he is a mediocre man who does not possess outstanding strength, and his skill worked on its own, and that is why it went unnoticed. It was for this reason that he struggled to utilize the numerous items at the rear of the team, but even this did not help him in any way, because he was still behind everyone and always remained in the rear. The decision that can completely change his fate, because he can help and save those adventurers as well as his girlfriend, who has already rushed into battle. Turns out finally the protagonist has pulled himself together and realized that those who will defeat this terrible witch. He, a friend of the protagonist, asks her to listen to him a little, and he tells her not to attack the witch and attack enemies with the help of the spirit of the earth. Of course, the girl immediately agreed.